Well, hello everybody and welcome back. I hope you've had a lovely Monday, whether you were in Burrington School with us or learning from home. Now it's time for our end of the day story, and chapter 10 of Charlotte's Web is called An Explosion. I hope you enjoy it. Day after day, the spider waited, head down, for an idea to come to her. Hour by hour she sat, motionless, deep in thought. Having promised Wilbur that she would save his life, she was determined to keep her promise. Charlotte was naturally patient. She knew from experience that if she waited long enough, a fly would come to her web. And she felt sure that if she thought long enough about Wilbur's problem, an idea would come to her mind. Finally, one morning towards the middle of July, the idea finally came. Why, how perfectly simple, she said to herself. The way to save Wilbur's life is to play a trick on Zuckerman. If I can fool a bug, thought Charlotte, I can surely fool a man, because people are not nearly as smart as bugs. Just at that moment, Wilbur walked into his yard. What are you thinking about, Charlotte? He asked. I was just thinking, said the spider, that people are very gullible. What does gullible mean? It means easy to fool, said Charlotte. That's a mercy, replied Wilbur, and he lay down in the shade of his fence and went fast asleep. The spider, however, stayed wide awake, gazing affectionately at him and making plans for his future. Summer was already half gone, and Charlotte knew she didn't have much time. Now that morning, just as Wilbur fell asleep, Avery Arable wandered into the Zuckerman's front yard, followed closely by Fern. Avery carried a live frog in his hand. Fern had a crown of daisies in her hair. The children ran for the kitchen. Just in time for a piece of blueberry pie, said Mrs. Zuckerman. Look at my frog, said Avery, placing the frog on the draining board and holding out his hand for pie. Ah! Take that thing out of here, said Mrs. Zuckerman. He's hot. He's almost dead, that frog, said Fern. He is not. He lets me scratch him between the eyes, see? The frog jumped and landed in Mrs. Zuckerman's dishpan full of soapy water. You're getting pie on you, said Fern. Can I look for eggs in the henhouse, Aunt Edith? No, run outdoors now, both of you, and don't bother the hens. It's getting all over everything, shouted Fern. He's got pie all down his front. Come on, frog, cried Avery. He scooped up the frog, and the frog kicked, splashing soapy water onto the blueberry pie. Let's swing on the swing, said Avery, and the children ran to the barn. Mr. Zuckerman had the best swing in the county. It was simple. A single long piece of heavy rope tied to the beam over the north doorway. At the bottom end of the rope was a big fat knot that you could sit on. It was arranged so that you could swing without being pushed. You climbed a ladder to the hayloft. Then, holding the rope, you stood at the edge and looked down. It was scary, and you felt dizzy. Then you straddled the knot so that it acted as a seat. Then you got up all your nerve, took a deep breath, and jumped. And just for a second, you seemed to be falling to the barn floor far, far below. But then, suddenly the rope would begin to catch you, and you would sail through the barn door going a mile a minute, with the wind whistling in your ears and eyes and hair, and then you would zoom up, up, up into the sky and look up at the clouds, and the rope would twist, and you would twist and turn with the rope. Then you would drop down, down, down out of the sky and come sailing back into the barn, almost back into the hayloft. Then sail out again, not quite as far this time. Then in again, not quite so high. Then out again, then in again, then out, then in. And then you'd jump off and fall down and let somebody else try it. Mothers for miles around worried about Zuckerman's swing. They feared some child would fall off one day. But do you know what? No child ever did. Children almost always hang on to things tighter than their parents think they can. Avery put the frog into his pocket and climbed the top of the hayloft. "The last time I swang in this swing, I almost crashed into a barn swallow," he yelled. "Take that frog out," ordered Fern. Avery ignored her, straddled the rope and jumped. He sailed through the door, frog and all, and into the sky, frog and all, and then sailed back into the barn. "Your tongue is purple," screamed Fern. "So is yours," cried Avery, sailing out again with the frog. "I have hay inside my dress. It itches," called Fern. "Then why don't you scratch it?" yelled Avery as he sailed back. "It's my turn. Jump off." "Fern's got the itch," sang Avery. Then he jumped off. He threw the swing up to his sister. She shut her eyes tightly and jumped, felt the dizzy drop, then the supporting lift of the swing. And when she opened her eyes, she was looking up into the blue sky and was about to fly back through the door. They took turns on the swing for more than an hour. And when they grew tired of swinging, they went down to the pasture and picked wild raspberries and ate them. Their tongues turned from purple to red. Fern bit into a raspberry that had a bad-tasting bug inside it and got a bit discouraged. Avery found an empty candy box and put his frog in it. The frog seemed rather tired after his morning on the swing. The children walked slowly up towards the barn. They too were tired and hardly had energy enough to walk. "Let's build a tree house," suggested Avery. "I want to live in a tree with my frog." I'm going to visit Wilbur," Fern announced. They climbed the fence into the lane and walked slowly towards the pig pen. Wilbur heard them coming and got up. It was at this point that Avery noticed a spider web, and coming closer, he saw Charlotte. "Hey, look! Look at that big spider!" he said. "It's tremendous!" "Leave it alone," commanded Fern. "You've got a frog. Isn't that enough?" "Oh, that's a fine spider. I'm going to catch it." Avery took the cover off the candy box and then picked up a stick. "I'm going to knock that big old spider into this box," he said. Wilbur's heart almost stopped when he saw what was going on, what was about to happen. This might be the end of Charlotte if the boy succeeded in catching her. "Avery, you stop it!" cried Fern. Avery put one leg over the fence of the pig pen. He raised his stick to hit Charlotte. And he was just about to when he lost his balance. He swayed and toppled and landed on the edge of Wilbur's trough. The trough tipped up and then came down with a slap. The goose egg was right underneath. There was a dull explosion as the egg broke, and then a foul smell filled the air. Fern screamed and held her nose. Avery jumped to his feet. The air was filled with terrible gases and smells from the rotten egg. Templeton, who had been resting in his home, scuttled away into the barn. "Ah, good night! Good night! What a stink! Let's get out of here!" screamed Avery. Fern was crying, holding her nose and running towards the house, and Avery ran after her, holding his nose. Charlotte felt amazingly relieved to see them go. It had been a lucky escape. Later on that morning, the animals came up from the pasture. The sheep, the lambs, the gander, the goose, and the 7 goslings. There were many complaints about the awful smell, and Wilbur had to tell the story over and over again of how the arable boy had tried to capture Charlotte, and how the smell of the broken egg had driven him away just in time. "It was the rotten goose egg that saved Charlotte's life," said Wilbur. The goose was proud of her share in this achievement. "I'm delighted that the egg never hatched," she gabbled. Templeton, of course, was miserable over the loss of his beloved egg, but he couldn't resist boasting a little. "See, it does pay to save things," he said in his surly voice. "A rat never knows when something is going to come in handy. I never throw anything away, and this is precisely why." "Well," said one of the lambs, "this whole business is all well and good for Charlotte, but what about the rest of us? The smell is unbearable. Who wants to live in a barn that's perfumed with rotten egg? Ugh." "Don't worry, you'll get used to it after a while," said Templeton. He sat up and pulled wisely on his long whiskers, and then crept away to pay a visit to the dump. When Lurvy showed up at lunchtime, carrying a pail of food for Wilbur, he stopped short a few paces of the pig pen, sniffed the air, and made a face. "What in thunder?" he said, setting the pail down. He picked up the stick that Avery had dropped and pried up the edge of Wilbur's trough. "Rats," he said. "I might have known a rat would make a nest under this trough. How I hate rats." And Lurvy dragged Wilbur's trough across the yard and kicked dirt into the rat's nest, burying the broken egg and all of Templeton's other possessions. Then he picked up the pail. Wilbur stood in the trough, drooling with hunger. Lurvy poured, and the slops ran creamily down around the pig's eyes and ears. Wilbur grunted. He gulped and sucked and gulped, making swishing and swooshing noises, anxious to get everything at once. It was a delicious meal. Skimmed milk, wheat middlings, leftover pancakes, half a donut, the rind of a summer squash, 2 pieces of stale toast, a third of a ginger snap, a fish tail, 1 orange peel, several noodles from a noodle soup, the skin off a cup of hot chocolate, an ancient jelly roll, a strip of paper from the lining of the garbage pail, and a spoonful of raspberry jelly. Wilbur ate heartily. He planned to leave half a noodle and a few drops of milk for Templeton. Then he remembered that the rat had been useful in saving Charlotte's life, and what Charlotte was trying to save his life, so he left a whole noodle instead of a half. Now that the broken egg was buried, the air cleared, and the barn finally smelt good again. The afternoon passed and evening came. The shadows lengthened, and the cool, kind breath of evening entered through the doors and the windows. Sitting astride her web, Charlotte sat moodily, eating a horsefly and thinking about the future. After a while, she stirred herself. She descended to the center of the web, and there she began to cut some of her lines. She worked slowly and steadily, while the other creatures drowsed. None of the others, not even the goose, noticed that she was hard at work. Deep in his soft bed, Wilbur snoozed. Over in their favorite corner, the goslings whistled a little night song. Charlotte tore quite a large section out of her web, leaving an open space in the middle, and then Charlotte started to weave something that would take the place of the threads she had removed. When Templeton got back from the dump around midnight, the spider was still hard at work. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you all tomorrow. Good night, everybody.